Welcome back to Missing. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing great today, Tim. I hope all the listeners out there are doing great as well. This conversation that we have is one that stems from this viral story that was in the public zeitgeist in 2020, and we're so fortunate to have such a talented professional filmmaker taking the helm of this story and talking to us about it. But Tim, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, very excited to introduce our conversation with director Patricia E. Gillespie. And she is a big deal in documentary filmmaking and made this new documentary called They Called Him Mostly Harmless. And it's on Max, or formerly known as HBO. And this is a story that I feel like we've spoken about on these airwaves, possibly with the middlemans of Othram Labs, who are featured in this documentary. They called him Mostly Harmless. So it's about a guy who was a hiker who was found deceased in 2018 in the Florida wilderness, and he was known to hikers on the trails as Mostly Harmless. So that's kind of the starting point for this documentary. There's a lot of time spent trying to identify this person. And in the documentary, a lot of that is sort of retold through conversations with these hikers, but also the internet got involved, Lance. And so a lot of digital sleuths got involved in trying to identify this fella, and eventually it worked. And so I don't want to tell you too much here. I want to play our interview with Patricia because it's really an interesting story, and you should definitely check out the documentary.
Right, and if you're a fan of this show and if you're a fan of the true crime genre, this is something that's going to be right in your wheelhouse because, like you said, it does involve Othram, it involves citizen sleuthing, and it involves an incredible mystery that the internet, and this is something that Patricia really hones in on, the internet was instrumental in uncovering some of the details about this person who was known as Mostly Harmless on the trails, and that becomes just as much a part of the story, his story, as his identity. So fascinating stuff, really great work from Patricia. And Tim, you said that Patricia was a big deal in the documentary filmmaking world. Well, people should check out her other work. You can see what she's done just on IMDb. Really great stuff.
Okay, we're going to play the interview in just a moment, but before we do, we got to tell you about Missing Premium. It is now available on Apple Podcasts, so you can subscribe to Missing Premium right there in your podcasts app. But if you're not an Apple user, you can go to missing.supportingcast.fm and sign up for the same product there. It's $4.99 a month. You get all ad-free listening, early releases, and our bonus show, which everybody loves. And this is bundled with Crawl Space, which is another one of our podcasts that people like.
All right, we're going to break for a commercial, and we'll be right back with the great Patricia Gillespie.
Welcome to the podcast, Patricia Gillespie. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. With this great project that is about to be released, definitely going to talk about that, but just doing a little bit of research on you, you have quite a resume. You have a fantastic resume, and personally speaking, the one that really stood out to me was your work on Blue Ruin. So I don't want to go down that road, but I saw that you worked on Blue Ruin, one of the greatest movies ever made. So well done there. But can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, what a blast from the past. I was a kid on that. I was a script supervisor. I'm Patricia Gillespie. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I guess it happened. So that is how I introduce myself, I guess.
How did it happen though? Because you sound like you're surprised it happened. You have won awards.
Well, I studied filmmaking, and I was really lucky to get to go to NYU thanks to some generous help from NYU. And I had initially begun studying as a narrative filmmaker. Yeah, and then I just got sucked into life in documentary. Blue Ruin, I think, was actually the last narrative film that I worked on. And, Jeremy's such a talent. He's gone on to have the director, Jeremy Saulnier, and he's gone on to have a Titanic career. But at the time, he was mostly shooting commercials, and he had placed this huge bet on himself, and he very kindly had me along. And I loved that experience, but I also really craved just connecting with ordinary people. And film people were carnies. We're not normal. And that speaks ill of carnies, which I don't mean to do. But we're a bunch of weirdos. And I really wanted to get out into the world, and documentary filmmaking was the closest to being a cowgirl or an adventurer that I could get in the modern context. And I just started making documentary films, and I loved it. I love people. And so I love getting to help to tell their stories, and I'm very, very lucky it worked out for me.
And we're going to issue the formal apology to our large carny audience base. We're sorry. This was not an insult. It was just a turn of phrase.
So what was your first documentary?
Well, when I was in college, I was an assistant to a filmmaker named Judith Helfand, and I also worked for a filmmaker named Jim Brown. And Jim sort of made these folk music documentaries, and Judith was making a lot of personal films about her life. And so I got to observe them. And, documentary assistantships are a funny thing because they morph into suddenly you're doing a lot more than managing the calendar or doing receipts. And you start to cut producing teeth. And so my first real big gig, I guess, was as a producer sort of, and a bunch of other things on an independent film called Unrest, which was directed by a woman named Jen Brea, who had a disease called MECFS, which is a pretty serious very serious autoimmune condition that 17 million people have, but the patient population is primarily female. And at the time, the medical community said it was all in your head. And so went sort of all over the world making a film about that. And it premiered at Sundance. And my career was off, and I did a bunch of other things. I made my first TV show when I was about 26 for Vice. And I definitely learned a lot there. And, that was something I'd started as an independent film because I got to a point where I realized no one was going to hire me to direct anything. I wasn't going to get promoted to director. I was going to have to greenlight myself. So I did there, and then ended up partnering with Vice and made that show, and it did real well. And I've just been lucky to get to keep working in this crazy world since then.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that show. This is The Devil You Know, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Can you, if you're comfortable, just maybe unpacking that a little bit? How did you make the connection with Vice, and what was the process to get you, working with them on that level?
Yeah, so I started that really just with my friend Kyle Porter and his grandma's Toyota Camry that she willed to him. And we were just like, we read this crazy story, and I talked to some people on Facebook, let's go. And then for 2 years, Kyle and I were really just sort of schlepping that uphill by ourselves. And we were trying to get grants and that sort of thing that independent films do a lot, which had been hugely successful on Unrest, and another film called Who Streets, which was a film I worked on as a producer, line producer. But I just couldn't garner that kind of support for that film. And I think some of it had to do with it being a true crime story and some ideas around true crime and whatever. But I had applied to something called the Hot Docs Forum, which is a pitch forum. And it's almost like an untelevised game show. They pick a couple projects and they put you in this room with all these decision makers and commissioning editors at this table with these lights on you. And you have 10 minutes to pitch your story. And we were very lucky to be selected for that and super well supported to help craft our pitch. And Vice was at the table, and they really liked it. So they picked that up. And like 2 weeks before that all was supposed to start, I got shipped up to Canada. They were just like, we actually have to make this in Canada instead of New York for the tax credit. So I gave my dog a couple Xanax, and we got on a plane. I moved to Canada for 8 months, and it was a really wild ride. It was a interesting place to work, but we got her done, and I'm proud that we were able to. One of the great things about that project is we were able to explore, I think, something deeper than the crime itself. We were able to explore like cycles of violence in the American working class. We're able to explore the opioid crisis. And a lot of my work, maybe true crime, which is what a lot of it's been labeled as, is the setting. But I think I'm often trying to explore a deeper issue inside those films. And then right at the tail end of that, I started developing my most recent film, other than this one, The Fire That Took Her, which is about a domestic violence survivor who fought to change the law after her boyfriend lit her on fire and only got 11 years for the crime. So I just started driving from Toronto to Ohio on my off days to film that. And 5 years later, that came to be. And, I've been obviously working on other stuff in the meantime. But that's sort of, it's weird how things come together. I wish there was a straightforward, when young filmmakers ask me this, I'm always like, I wish there was a straightforward path I could give you, but it's sort of just grabbing what you can.
And how did you hear about the story of Mostly Harmless?
Yeah, so funny, going back to The Devil You Know, I had briefly been at a company I was starting to work with a company called Warrior Poets, which just shut down before we got to make the film, or I can't remember how that worked out, or Vice took it in house. I can't remember. Anyway, there was a young executive there named Ethan Goldman who went on, 10 years later to found his own company called Anchor Entertainment. And Ethan and I we really got on, and we always really wanted to work on something together. And we just had all these near misses of getting to work together. Things just, the stars not quite aligning, the schedule's not quite aligning. And then he called me with this project, which he had already, the case had already ended. He'd already set it up at Max, or what is now Max. And he asked if I wanted to direct it. And I read the story and my jaw was on the floor. And I absolutely did want to direct it, because not just because of the mystery, but because I think of the story's potential to help us examine these weird lives we're leading online and their intersection with our real lives. And, I think I just thought the story had a lot to say about what it means to live in the digital age.
Yeah. And had you heard of this prior to that?
I had heard of it in that, it was in my periphery. I think I'd read the first Wired article. I really love my job, so I work a lot and I am not super online, but I'd heard about the story, but I'm not sure. I don't think I had heard about the solve until Ethan called. And once I read that article Nick Thompson did, I was just enraptured and fascinated and found it so complex and multi-layered, and dug happily right in.
Very cool. All right, well, tell us about the story of this documentary. What happened?
So at the end of the Eastern Continental Trail, which includes the Appalachian Trail, it runs from Canada to South Florida, this man was discovered in a place called Big Cypress National Preserve, a really sort of wild area of the Eastern Continental Trail, the Florida Trail. And he was discovered deceased, and he weighed only 86 pounds. And he, despite having a bunch of food in his tent, and he had no wallet, no credit cards, no photo ID, no cell phone, none of these things that you and I, pretty much have one or more of these things on us at all times that tell you who we are. So the Collier County Sheriff's Office, the police down there, tried to figure out who he was, ran some fingerprints, and couldn't figure it out. And so they released what's called a composite, sort of a rendering of what this person might have looked like in life, and put it on the internet. And it turned out over 20 people had seen or met this guy. And some of them had even taken photographs. But he only introduced himself by his trail name, which is a nickname you get if you're hiking the Appalachian Trail, which was Mostly Harmless. And he'd never given anyone his real name or any serious identifying details about himself. But he'd interacted with these people. He'd camped with these people. He'd shared some intimate moments with these people. They just didn't know who he was. And so the hiker community has an online presence, and that sort of cross-pollinated the sleuth community. And they were off to the races trying to figure out who this Mostly Harmless character was in life. And the film sort of charts that process, as well as, actually identifying him, which it turns out he was absolutely not who everybody thought he was during the search.
Yeah, it was like this person was two people before he went on this quest to remove himself from the public population. He was one person before that, obviously, and another person after that. But the difference between the two people seems on the surface to be so stark, so dramatic. I'm wondering, how did you approach that, knowing that you're telling the story of like two different people in this one body?
It's interesting. I think, like I said, one of the things that really fascinated me about this story was this sort of interrogation of the digital space and what the internet does to how we view ourselves, how we view each other, how we treat each other. And I think one of the things, the internet has become, especially social media, has become sort of an outrage machine, right? That which pisses you off the most gets the most clicks, views, and shares, or that which is the most sensational. And I think part of that has led to some black and white thinking, or at the very least, black and white thinking being rewarded online. So things are all good, or they're all bad, or, it's us and them. And people are really a lot more complex than that. And most of us have the capacity to do both bad and good. Most of us have done both bad and good. But the internet makes us have that thought of this must be two different people. But in reality, I think he was absolutely, one that both of those elements, it wasn't a Jekyll and Hyde thing. I think both of those elements, just the things he did wrong, which is, I don't want to spoil the movie too much, but is revealed toward the end of the movie, were as integrated into him as the things he did right. And particularly, some of the hikers, a young man named Brandon, who, they had a pretty deep talk about history and about what it's like to be a man in this world and to try to, go your own way and heal. I think that was a genuine interaction. And I think that the kindness and decency and care that he showed Brandon showed him was real. And I don't think that means it was another person who did those bad things, which are unequivocally bad. I make no excuses for this guy's bad behavior. And there's so much more I'd like to say about that, but would absolutely spoil the film. But I don't make any excuses for that. Wrong is wrong. And, I believe the people who said he did wrong, but I also believe the people who said he did right and made them feel seen.
Yeah. So tell us about the hiking community. And you mentioned Brandon, but what about other people who had, I guess, run-ins with Mostly Harmless? What were their takeaways?
Yeah, the people who met him really liked him. He was sort of a kind, quiet, polite, relatively good-looking, relatively young, nice, wholesome guy is how he appeared on the trail, which there was a lot more to that than meets the eye. But he really connected with a lot of people. And the people in the film are just a few of many. But their perception of him was extremely positive.
And I'm like endlessly curious to find out where your thought process goes and your work process goes when you are beginning to tell the story. Are you looking for certain things, or are you letting the people you're interviewing sort of direct you as far as the narrative that you're putting out there? Because you just mentioned about like him being nuanced and there's good and bad in everybody, and you need to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Was that something that came to you as you were talking to people? And
I think that was something that was I understood there would be a challenge trying to reconcile this person that people had seen and the person that we knew existed in his life before the trail. And I was excited to explore that challenge. As a filmmaker, I really try to go into these stories without answers and with a lot of questions. And, that's just part of my work process. I try to be really open and let the people who live the story tell it, and then figure out how best to sort of arrange that, right? I had a real running start on this one because so much of the search itself went down on the internet, which was like this time capsule, because the internet's forever, right? So you can see minute by minute how these people were feeling, the questions they were asking, what they were doing. You can look back in really great detail at how the case was solved. So I knew that would be a part of it. And I knew I didn't want to tell the story just about this man or just about his death or I didn't want to tell that story. I wanted to tell this sort of 1,000-foot view community story of the search, the people that searched for him, which I think was a great act of generosity, and like this myth making that we do online that we really need to start looking at and considering.
Yeah, so that culture of, I guess, online citizen sleuths kind of interested you, something you kind of dove into in this movie. Were there any patterns that you picked up on in between some of the folks that you interviewed?
Yeah. So look, it's not giving anything away to say that the two sleuths that are featured in the movie are two women, Christy Harris and Natasha Teasley. And they are both leaders in their own right. They each had a group. Each group was instrumental to solving this case. And a lot of times they were put at odds against one another. There was a little drama in the middle of solving this. But one of the things that I found so remarkable was, if you were to take it out of this online context and these two groups with these two women being pit against one another, they had a lot in common. They were both working class women who were pillars in their families, who worked really hard all day and came home at the end of the day and ultimately decided to donate what little time they had to trying to solve this case and trying to give some answers to a family they didn't even know. And I thought there was something really generous about that, altruistic and, almost heroic, that, when you're struggling, just to, like we all are, to keep your own life together, that you say, no, you know what, I'm going to spend a bunch of hours doing this. I was amazed at, obviously they're two very different people, but I was amazed at how much they had in common and how much the internet obscured what they had in common. And also in terms of mental health, like these are women who are both bullied by the internet, and it affected them profoundly emotionally. In really similar ways. And one of the things I was excited about was being able to show these people who are seen as, people, you got to pick a side. Is it Christy or Natasha? It's like, well, no, these are kind of gals going through a similar thing with similar intentions.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Just examining the statement that they're doing this thing that is almost heroic. And I agree with you. I think that it is, on some level, a form of heroism, because you are giving answers on some level to family members and friends and loved ones. But it comes with that cost of, you're going to most likely be bullied online. You're going to be pit against somebody else. You're going to have to spend some of that time defending your findings against somebody who probably hasn't done the amount of research or close to what you've done. So what did you see in them that maybe gave you a little bit of an indication of an answer as to why they do this? What's the reward for them?
I think they're just good people. What I saw in both of them is I saw myself. I saw somebody who was told, you can't do this. Who the hell do you think you are, Missy? And they were like, watch me. I grew up working class. I am not supposed to get to have the cool job that I have. Like and at a certain point, you just have to go for it. And these are two women that went for it. And they're also two women who, I think it's fair to say, like, there's a perception of people who do sleuth work or just, working class women in general, that is diminutive. That's kind of like, haha, and I wanted to show how deeply complex and worth examining and worth celebrating they are. And, I think a lot of my filmmakerly energy went into that. I think these are people who were disempowered, right? Christy wanted to be in the FBI all her life, and life circumstances worked out that she couldn't be. Natasha is not a true crime person. She's an outdoors person, but she was working at this company and as a woman getting paid less than her male colleagues and kind of running the whole thing and not being compensated for it. And, and all of a sudden they come to the internet and they're like, I can have agency here. Like, no one cares about the things you're reading on to me. It just matters whether I can do my job. And furthermore, I'm going to take this job and I'm not going to try to use it to make money or make myself famous. I'm going to try to use it to help a family that I may never meet, that may never even thank me, that I may not even know their names. I just thought that was really cool. And I work in crime storytelling a lot. It's not on purpose. It's just the stories I gravitate towards. A lot of times the stakes or the setting of the film happens to be centering a mystery or a crime. There's been a lot of discourse about that over the last couple of years about, and a lot of it's been critical, right? A lot of it's been important ethical questions we need to ask makers of true crime content. I'm all for that, but some of it's been condescending to the audience or diminishing of the audience, and that stuff always really bothers me, because I think a lot of people are interested in these stories not because of the lurid details or like, I don't think it's like people are showing up for a sexy murder party or whatever way that gets characterized online. I think people want to hear stories about people facing tough things, people facing tragedy, people facing death, people facing violence, people facing quote unquote evil, and maintaining their humanity and fighting to seek answers and fighting to seek justice and fighting to create the world they want to live in. And I wanted to pay tribute to that community and that exercise in empathy that I think true crime audiences or the true crime community, I don't know what that means, but it's a term that people throw around a lot, that this exercise in empathy that they undertake when they do this. And I wanted people to stop and think before they dismiss them, just as much as I wanted to say these things about myth making on the internet and who we really are. And I hope we succeed in doing that.
It reminds me of the cliche about the nightly news, where if it bleeds, it leads, and things have to be salacious, and there has to be like, whip pans and fast motion stuff to keep your attention. But we've found, and this is exactly what you're talking about, we've found in our audience base, people, when they're introduced to the story that they want to hear, the story that shows somebody overcoming the adversity, getting the best of the situation and coming out of it a better person, they want to hear that more than they want to see the salacious stuff. It's just the salacious stuff is everywhere.
It's why I always bristle at this term true crime or true crime girlies or true crime. Because I just think that's a term that's thrown at a whole lot of work that's not necessarily all related. I think there is work that centers around, there's crime storytelling that's about things that really matter, that's about bigger issues, that's about people that deserve to be centered and, stories that need to be told. And then there's stuff that's like sexy love triangle murder party. And I think those are two totally different genres, but they get lumped together. And I think the audience is capable of a lot more than maybe sometimes the greater structures of the industry anticipate. But I'm excited to be making films during this time because I think they're learning. I think they're catching up, particularly at Max, Liz Mazzy, our exec, and Jason Solarnis, who's now the president of the network. At the time, I believe he was the president of investigative content. They really have an expansive vocabulary for where this form can go. And it was a real delight to make that there and to get to be creative and to get to look at these character studies, because I do this work for the people. I really care about the people in my films, and I'm really excited to see them discover themselves. And it's important to get with a network or a commissioning editor or whatever, however you arrange your work, that allows you to do that. And I was very, very lucky that we were allowed to do that here.
So you've spoken a little bit about how the internet helped play a role in identifying Mostly Harmless, but was it harmful at all, or are there any stories or anecdotes you can tell us how it went the wrong way involving the internet?
Sure. So look, there's some things in the film, right? People get misidentified. People bully each other. And, even though we want to pretend the internet isn't real, like I said, as we live our lives increasingly online, it is real. You can do legitimate harm there and legitimate good, right? So I think those two things come up in a pretty, they're pretty straightforwardly laid bare in the film. But I'm not sure the problem is sleuthing. I think the problem is the internet. I think the problem is this black and white thinking, our willingness to attack, our willingness to say things we would never say in real life, our lack of an ability to give people the benefit of the doubt or get to know them the way you might in your living room or in a bar or at school or wherever you are. And I think those really are the pitfalls that can be harmful. And I hope that people see the film, and even if they're not at all engaged in sleuthing or whatever, that they consider their own behavior online and how they read other people online. Because, look, even if you're not in this subculture, this sleuth world, you're probably on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or whatever. Pick whatever generation you're in, there's one for you, right? And, it's the thing that's happening here is just like a very intense version of when you see that girl you went to high school with and she's got a big house and a million kids and what's wrong with me that I don't have that? Or, or when you see that guy in the Ferrari, or you see the post about the happy family on Facebook, all home for Christmas, and your kid's not talking to you, right? And you tell these stories about these people and it can hurt you. And the story isn't always necessarily true.
Yeah, it certainly does get you in this spiral of self-judgment, right? When you're looking at all of these other things that are only posted because they're so much better, right? You only post something because it's so much better. And for the most part, people aren't aware that they're doing that or having that impact to the folks that are looking at the posts.
I noticed I was making this, I started to think about that a lot more. And I was like, what am I posting? Like, okay, well, I'm not super on social media. It's funny. Somebody asked me, I'm doing a press block, so I have a bunch of these, and someone's like, what's your Instagram? I'm like, do you want to see pictures of my dog? Because I don't post a lot else there. But
the answer is
yes. But P.E.Gillespie at Instagram, if you want to see pictures of Hank, but who thankfully hasn't barked through this entire thing. I'm really impressed with him. He'll get a treat. But I started to think like also about the positive stuff I post, because I was like always like, oh, my Instagram's so neutral because I don't really get into, I really just keep it wholesome, keep it clean, try not to piss anyone off, because I'd rather have those conversations at a table with someone than have online fights with people. But then I'm like, man, even when I post a good thing, like I really have to be careful to explain that this isn't something that just happened to me because I'm excellent, or like I'm a lucky girl and you're not. Like this is something that like every success I ever had in my life had so much failure behind it, and that's something we don't see a lot online. And because of this black and white thinking where we want something to be all good or all bad, we edit those tough parts out. And I think that that's a lot of what happened with Mostly Harmless himself. People were like, this is our victim. This is the person we want to save. So he must be good and pure. And then like, what do you know? When you find out who he is, he's just like everybody else and, did some really bad stuff. And that to me is just so fascinating to turn over in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was he doing on the Appalachian Trail?
We will never know that. Exactly, right? Because if you don't leave some kind of clue, like a manifesto or whatever, you don't live inside someone's head. Once somebody passes away, you can never fully understand their motivations. And that's something as somebody who works telling stories about people who've passed away a lot of the time, I try really hard to keep that in mind. So I don't know exactly. I think, which is a supposition, like I'm just making off the cuff, I like to read it as a desire. I think he maybe was trying to be a better person. And maybe that's because I'm optimistic about humanity. And maybe I shouldn't be. And maybe people take issue with that. But I really love people. I love people even when I don't love what they do, even when I don't fully agree with them, even when I full on reject some of their history. I love people and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I'd like to give him a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt. But I'm also really careful. I don't want to be here to be an apologist without spoiling the movie, for his actions. Like that's not okay. But you can be not okay and then try to be better. And I think I would like to see our culture open up more of a space for people to allow themselves to be wrong and improve, which I think the internet is maybe starting to think about learning to do.
I think you're totally on with that. I think there were so many things that he recognized in his life that were adding to the pressure and becoming triggers for him that he didn't want to become triggers. And
I'm a diehard feminist, and I made this film through the female gaze. But I also think it's about, I think it's tough to be a man right now, especially in terms of mental health and image rehab. And I don't mean that in some kind of apologistic, gross manosphere way. I don't mean it like that, but I do mean, I think that it was really I think it was really complicated to try to right the ship for him. And I think that that's a story worth telling. And I think it's actually a feminist issue, that it's hard for men to admit they're wrong and try to fix it and get the support to try to fix it. And I think the story of Brandon in the film hopefully starts to hint at that, Yeah,
it reminds me of a conversation I was having with my partner and one of her friends about that exact topic, like what young men are taught, especially young men before the internet, are taught by their parents and taught by their friends' parents, and how they have to live their life one way, which ultimately results in you're shutting yourself off from the things that are important to communicate to people that you love. And then if you have mental health issues on top of that, it just further accelerates anything bad or any dire consequences that are now inevitable.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to woman-splain to you, which is a little bit what I'm doing.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, I think that some of what and I have to be so careful not to spoil the mystery of the film, but I think some of this, what we're talking about, this black and whiteness online, and that there's, all good, all bad, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say, whatever, it really makes that discourse really difficult, because you almost have to apologize for having it. And even when I'm on here myself, as somebody who has a body of work that's pretty much unquestioningly, you look at my IMDb, you're like, oh, that's a girl's girl, right? But I still feel I have to say, like, oh, like, I just want to be clear, I don't support misogyny. And like, I notice that even in myself when I want to be like, hey, we have a problem here. And I feel like the internet itself has made this discourse so hard, because even to talk about that problem, you have to make a bunch of sort of pre-qualifying statements about, and I do think that it wouldn't have been that way before the internet was the way it was. And don't get me wrong, for all the harm the internet can do, it can also do a lot of good. And we show both of those things in the film, I think. But it does make it hard to talk about this stuff. And making this, there was a lot of sensitivity around, well, are you painting him as a bad guy or a good guy? And I'm like, I'm painting him as a person. I'm only going to say what's true. I'm going to prioritize being honest and also try not to harm anyone. And that's my answer. Like, I don't know, good guy, bad guy, like, that's not my business. I don't know. That's for somebody else to decide, and it's not me. But it's, we have a desire to ask that question and make those classifications, I think, a lot because of this digital age we're living in, which is the subdermal theme in this film for me.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And how did Othram Labs come to be part of this documentary?
So, well, I mean, they were part of the story. So they were some of the earliest people we went to. In the story, they are a big part of cracking the case. So Othram is a cutting-edge DNA company that does something called autosomal DNA. I will explain this. Your audience probably knows.
They'll love it.
We're pretty familiar with the Middlemans. We've had them on a few times here.
Oh, okay, great. Well, then I won't womansplain autosomal DNA.
No, it still will help, I'm sure.
Okay, but basically, autosomal DNA allows you to, it's DNA. The way traditional DNA works is it gives you a yes or no answer. You can compare it to other samples of DNA and say, yes, this is the person. No, this is not the person, right? Autosomal DNA looks at so many different factors in the genome. I hope I'm saying this right, David Middleman, if you're listening, that it actually gives you leads and clues rather than a simple yes, it is, no, it is an answer. And you can identify relatives of the person. You can identify their possible ethnic background or heritage. You can make guesses about where this person lives or is from. And this information in this case was really crucial because DOE cases get solved by exposure. They get solved by the right person, realizing that an unidentified person is in fact their missing loved one. And it's all about likes and shares and visibility and the right person seeing it. But in this particular case, Othrum's genetic profile helped narrow down to a region. So the energy of these thousands of sleuths could be focused on one place. Sometimes Othram will solve a case because they, run the autosomal DNA and they say, oh, we know his second cousin, we'll call him up. In this case, but a lot of that's dependent on who took the 23andMe and uploaded it to GEDmatch or, whatever platform share information with law enforcement. And there are plenty of reasons people might not choose to do that. There's a lot of questions around privacy, but I had them before I started this film. And then I started making the film and I talked to the middlemans and I was like, oh, I'm going to go swab my face and upload it to GEDmatch now because, but that's a deeper discussion that they're probably much more enlightening on. But yeah, so they were really key in this. And if I'm not this is, I believe the first time they crowdfunded a case. Now they have a platform called DNA Solves that you can check out tons of unidentified or missing persons cases and or unidentified persons cases and donate to them. And even things like $5 really helps because one of the things I like to mention is that because these cases get solved by availability or visibility, it's important to remember that not everybody garners the kind of attention and energy that Mostly Harmless did as a, relatively good-looking, relatively young white guy found in a mysterious circumstance that generate a lot of public interest. Sometimes these people are people who, because of unconscious bias in society or the circumstances or the era they were found in, they just don't get liked and shared and plastered everywhere. And we can be a part of fixing that. There's a lot of people of color, people from immigrant populations, women from sex work, the list goes on and on and on, Indigenous people in particular, that just aren't getting the volume of shares somebody like Mostly Harmless did. And that's something for $0 and 2 seconds of your time that you can change. You can just see either the unidentified person's composite or the missing persons flyer and share it. And you're actually doing something, which I did not realize before I started telling this story, that you don't have to go full sleuth to be involved in solving the problem.
Right. That was one of my questions, was taking a story like this that received such media attention because of those circumstances, how do you then communicate a message to people and say, hey, but there are all of these other stories. There are all of these other stories that take very little time to do. So you just kind of answered my question before I could ask it, which is nice. So I appreciate that. And is that something that you are going to take in your life personally and become even a bigger proponent of, a even bigger spokesperson for?
Yeah, I think the spokesperson should be Christy Harris, and if she feels like it, Natasha Teasley, the sleuths in the film. I am no expert. I bear witness, and that's, I'm just a set of eyes and ears. But in my own life, I'm definitely way more conscious of this stuff. Like, I stop and read missing persons posters in my neighborhood. I live in Queens, New York, the best borough. And, you see these things around sometimes, and I really read them and I really take a minute to think, and did I see anything? I also, when I see them online, I'm not super online, but when I am online, I'm way more likely to share things. I share them. If they come across, I share them. And so should I be a spokesperson? Absolutely not. Not enough of an expert, but I am very down to throw in for the effort. And I hope that the film, I think the best way that I can advocate is that the film encourages people to do that. Because if you have a couple thousand people sharing this stuff, it's exponential, right? 1,000 people sharing something does a lot more than 100 people sharing something. And if you can watch this film and just go, oh, I'm going to share it, you might be able to bring somebody home to their family and give their family closure.
Well, thank you so much, Patricia, for spending some time with us here today. What's next for you?
I can't tell you.
It's Blue Ruin 2, isn't it?
No, you'd have to call Jeremy about that. I'm making a film. I'm in the early stages of making a film that centers another crime, but in a very different way, in a very different context than you'd expect. So, and it has a lot of those themes I'm interested in about class and gender roles and people trying to be the heroes in their own lives. So look out for it, but not anytime super soon.
Well, whenever it's ready and you're doing the press for that one, you're more than welcome to come back on and talk about it. And yeah, if you want to come back on to talk about any of the other work that you've done, feel free. Doors open.
Thank you, fellas. I really appreciate it.